maintaining personal relationships and allowing those relationships to grow in the context of a story that is primarily focused on larger scale, more sociological conflicts is more difficult than it is to simply maintain and make convincing those relationships when they are the focus of the narrative. If the relationships are the focus of the narrative, then the creative minds behind that work can simply pour all of their effort and time into depicting this relationship in all of its different facets and all different kinds of scenarios and situations. So we get these different shadings, we get these different textures of the relationship. When the relationship is secondary, like we see in the Owl House, both for Hunter and Willow, and even for the Luce and Amity pairing, you can't quite do that. If the relationship were to take up too much time and too much space in the work, it would grow a little distracting. Not because the relationship itself is bad, but because the show has demonstrated ambitions to be beyond merely a show focusing on these specific relationships. It is more focused on this grander, more comprehensive portrait of these different tensions and different anxieties and different themes that weave their way through the lives of many different characters. And yet, the Owl House is astute enough that it manages to, despite not making these romantic relationships focal, nonetheless make them compelling, not only in the case of Luce and Amity, but now also as we move into the end of the show in the case of Hunter and Willow. What the show has done is difficult for most shows to pull off, especially within a rather constrained time frame, and yet the Owl House manages to do it twice and without spending a surfeit of time on each relationship. So how does this work? How does the show manage to pull off such a feat? Let's examine more closely the Hunter and Willow relationship. What does it provide them both? That is a question that I think is important to ask, to look at the relationship from a somewhat detached, somewhat disinterested perspective, and look at what each person is getting out of it. Not in a transactional way, not in a cold-hearted way, but just in a way that is looking intently at these characters' psyches. Hunter has been desperate for a sense of confidence and a sense of certainty in himself for a long time. He has been isolated in the Emperor's Coven, isolated since he was conceived as this strange clone for Baelos's brother, and the only node of support he had was Baelos, who was attempting to manipulate him for his own purposes, and managed to convince Hunter that Hunter's entire sense of self-worth, his entire sense of validation, depended on Baelos. So Hunter has lost that authority figure in his life, and he has a fractured psyche in need of healing, in need of a sort of reinvigoration and revivification. And he finds that in Willow. She is confident, she is sure of herself. She is tender-hearted, and she does deeply care about him, and is interested in really helping heal his broken psyche, but she is also someone strong, someone committed, someone reliable. He knows that, and she likes being thought of in that light. Willow is so used to being thought of as the rather dorky, unimportant, rather secondary one. She is more or less a secondary character who knows that she is a secondary character. Even though she has done a lot to transform the initial image that others had of her, like Luce and Amity, she still is defined somewhat by that image. Amity still remembers her as this helpless little dork who couldn't really do much of anything for herself. Even Luce, despite being very sympathetic toward her, thinks of her to a certain extent in that light. She can't help it. Hunter, however, does not have that background. He simply sees her as a reliable, determined, strategically thoughtful person who makes plans and executes them, who knows what she wants and takes the steps to secure that. So, he trusts her, and she likes being trusted. She likes being thought of in that regard. It helps complete her own character journey. But what's remarkable is that the show manages to do this in a relatively condensed time frame. Remember, Hunter was not even a part of the show until Season 2, and he does not become a character that we know quite a bit about until the second half of Season 2. He doesn't even meet Willow until the second half of Season 2, and yet the relationship between them is strong. It is evident. It is clear why these two are so close to each other. It is clear what they are both getting out of this relationship, how it's benefiting them both. Now, let's look at how this differs from some other examples. Just to demonstrate how remarkable and interesting I think the feat of the Owl House here is, think about the relationship between Aang and Katara on Avatar: The Last Airbender. That I am not the biggest fan of this relationship, I have said quite a few times, so I'm not going to rehash those points here. What I am going to say is that the show has a bit of an uphill battle selling this relationship because, again, romance is not the focus of the show. It is secondary. The focus is more on these large-scale historical, sociological conflicts and how these characters psychologically process these conflicts and try to come up with some sort of catharsis, some sort of inner harmony that will translate into being able to bring a sort of external harmony to the outside world. So, these romantic relationships, while not bad, are very much not the focus. They're not the center of the show, even if they are an aspect that fandom, as fandom always does, fixates on. Even the Sokka and Suki pairing, for instance, which most people like, is not probably in the top 10 or 15 things that someone would mention loving about the show, or even loving about Sokka's character. And the Aang and Katara pairing is even worse off, because the show does try to a certain extent to advance the idea of these two being capable of really fixing themselves into this solid, substantial, firm relationship, but the show can only do that in these episodes that feel a bit mechanistic. They feel a bit inorganic, such as the Cave of the Two Lovers, the Fortune Teller to an extent, or the Headband. Now, I don't hate any of these episodes, but they do not feel like they are organic to the basic ideas of the show. They feel like detours, and not in the interesting way that incorporates themes and concepts that course through the blood of the show in a different or unexpected way. They just feel a bit unnecessary. Not that they don't contribute at all to the show, but that they feel like stray appendages in a way. Now compare that to a scenario wherein the romantic relationship is the focus of the work. That doesn't mean this work needs to be entirely focused on romance, but the romance is tied intimately to the overall construction of the narrative. One of the most successful works made in this form in the last 10 years or so is Kimi no Na wa, Your Name. The conflicts of the film, all of these ideas of memory and the relationship between the past and the present, the contrast between the city and the countryside, between these old, overgrown half-forgotten traditions and the bustling modern world and all its opportunities and all its loneliness, all of this is not subordinated to the romantic relationship, but the romance runs through all of these ideas. There is the sense of trying to create a connection in a way that is outside of the ordinary, exhausting, enervating rush of modern society on a more than material level, to try and plunge deep within the self, beyond the ordinary self projected at the world, and finding deep in the self this connection to the other, and discovering that it is not so other, not so different, not so alien after all. It is what Northrop Frye calls the mythos of spring, the burgeoning of new opportunities, of new connections, pushing back against these boundaries, these structures, creating disconnect through this profusion of passion, through this profusion of romantic energy. It's comedy in Northrop Frye's word, not in the haha sense, but in the sense that love, this bond between these two passionate people, is able to overwhelm these rigid structures of authority, these rigid structures of control. Here in Kimi no Na wa, there are actual formal structures, such as Mitsuha's father, the mayor, but also the grandiose structures of this distance created by time and physical distance, and the idea, the experience that we have of this distance being insurmountable because we are looking at things from this purely modern, purely materialist perspective, instead of plunging deep into the old, the primordial waters of the self and realizing that we are more than our material selves, that we can have this connection on this unexpected, murky, wildly mysterious and spiritual kind of way that goes beyond how we normally perceive the world. It is a story of revitalization and revivification. But what do you do when you have a story like The Owl House, which is focused on Belos, to a certain extent focused on his grandiose ambitions to basically kill all of the witches? How do you weave the romantic relationship into that overall story without making that romantic relationship the focus of the story? The Owl House is quite good at this, and this is a big reason why I think, at least in its portrayal of its romantic relationships, it does rise above Avatar. The singular and the specific is a reflection of the more general ethos and general spirit of the work. One thinks of Aristotle's distinction between epic and tragedy, and how he prefers tragedy because it is more constrained, because every part belongs to the whole, because there are no extraneous meandering elements. Now, you could say that Aristotle is a bit limited in his preference for such a singular, rigid unit, an atom, as the ideal for what a work should be, but he is right that having all these extraneous elements that don't really tie back to the heart of the show can be a bit distracting. It can make the show a bit diffuse. But The Owl House manages to go beyond that. It's a show that is about the importance of desperately trying to form these connections, of desperately trying to reach beyond the sense of loneliness that comes from merely adhering to your expected idea of who you are, that is set upon you both by yourself and by societal standards. Belos is unable to do this. Instead of expanding his perceptions when he comes into the demon realm, he instead doubles down on his vehement anti-witch disdain. Whereas the other characters can go beyond that. Willow and Hunter express, like Loose and Amity, the sense of curiosity for looking at different people who have these different backgrounds, of really interacting with them and getting to know them. And in this getting to know them, really realizing that this person can be a part of the self. They can be a part of who we think of ourselves as, instead of all of us having to be these little isolated, atomized cells living in this constantly amorphous, constantly disturbing world. There's this sense of connection. There's this sense of reaching out beyond the mere individual to a greater sense of harmony and peace, and I really like that. The show does a very smart and astute job demonstrating that. So thank y'all for watching. If you liked what you saw today, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Donate to my Patreon if you can. And you want to see more videos like this, keep watching The Owl House. It's a fantastic show. My next video will be coming soon. Believe me about that. Adios, comrades.